My name is Courtney Blake. I'm 34 years old, and until sunrise today, I believed I had a firm grasp on what family loyalty meant, what legacy meant, and what it meant to belong to something larger than myself. But everything shattered in a single morning when my sister barged into my cramped second-floor apartment in Baltimore without knocking, tracking cold air in with her perfume-heavy confidence, and dropping a neatly folded notice onto my kitchen table like she was presenting a trophy. On that paper, printed in sharp professional font, was a number so absurd it stole the breath from my lungs, $8, 100, my new rent for the same tiny apartment I'd managed for years, the same building my grandmother had spent 4 decades nurturing into a community rather than a profit machine, and Whitney stood there watching me process it with a smirk curled at the corner of her mouth. A smirk that told me she wasn't just following orders, but savoring the moment she got to watch me sink. An hour later my parents called, their voices coated in a polished corporate calmness that felt colder than anger, explaining why this increase was fair market value, why I should be grateful the building is finally catching up with the times, and why keeping rents affordable had been a favor that was never meant to last, as if the people who lived here, people who trusted me, were numbers to shift around on a spreadsheet instead of human beings, with memories stitched into the very walls they slept against. They talked circles around me with words like growth, opportunity, and return, but not once did they acknowledge that no normal person in this building, Mrs. Alvarez with her trembling hands, the Kim family with their boxes of toys, Mr. Novick with his walker, could survive an increase like that, and all the while they spoke, all the while my sister gloated, they never realized that under my fingernails was still the faint trace of ink from a very different set of documents. Documents I had quietly been reviewing for years, documents my grandmother had entrusted to me long before any of them smelled profit, because for the past 4 years I haven't just been the woman who fixes leaks and handles broken mailboxes. Thanks to my grandmother, I've been sitting on a secret that flips this entire decision upside down and turns my sister's power trip into the first domino in her own unraveling. By late afternoon, the weight of everything pressed so hard against my ribs that I stepped into the hallway for air, only to find the entire building buzzing with fear, doors opening, floors creaking under anxious footsteps, whispers bouncing off the old wallpaper like static electricity, because news like this spreads fast when livelihoods depend on it. Mrs. Alvarez looked at me with wet, frightened eyes clutching an envelope she could barely steady, while Mr. Novick muttered numbers as though recalculating could conjure a miracle. And farther down the hall, the Kims packed their daughters' toys while trying to answer questions they had no answers for, and every face carried the same silent plea, "Tell us we are safe." But I didn't know how to lie, and I didn't know how to tell them the truth yet either, not until I was sure what kind of weapon my grandmother had put in my hands. When the hallway finally quieted, Marian Flores, the woman who knew this building's heartbeat almost as well as my grandmother did, appeared at my door without panic, without pity, just a quiet certainty in her eyes as she stepped into my kitchen and folded her scarf like she was preparing for a conversation she'd been holding inside for years. She spoke plainly about things she had witnessed long before I understood them myself, glances passed between my grandmother and my parents during holiday dinners, small disagreements about the building's future, subtle shifts in the way my sister interacted with tenants as soon as she realized the building was profitable. And she told me something that made the air around me tighten. My grandmother never kept important documents where people expected. She hid things in places only someone who truly paid attention would ever find, and she believed those things were meant for me, not anyone else. Marian said my grandmother anticipated a moment where compassion and greed would collide, and she trusted only one person to make the right decision when it happened. After Marian left, the silence of the apartment felt heavier than before, almost guiding me toward the place I had avoided exploring since the night my grandmother passed. So with a ring of old keys she gave me years ago, I made my way down to the basement, a faded metal door groaning as I shoved it open, stepping into a room full of forgotten objects, dusty boxes, coiled extension cords, leftover paint cans, and yet the space felt charged, like the walls themselves knew what I was searching for. I moved slowly, letting memory guide my hands until I found her old sewing cabinet, the one she refused to throw away even when the drawers jammed, and when I pushed it aside, I saw what I had somehow missed for years. A narrow crack in the floor panel, too deliberate to be accidental. I pried it open and uncovered a weatherproof box, heavy and cold, and inside it were folders bound with elastic, sealed envelopes, and a tin holding a set of keys with a note written in her looping cursive saying only, for when the time comes. A message so simple yet so heavy it made my chest tighten. In the first folder was the truth. Notarized documents naming me as the sole owner of Blake Heritage LLC, my signature printed beneath hers. From a day I thought I was helping her with routine paperwork, not realizing she had quietly transferred the entire building into my control. Another folder contained printed emails between my sister and a redevelopment firm, cold, calculating exchanges about projected vacancy rates, profit margins and timelines designed to push current residents out under the guise of modernization. As I kept reading, as I absorbed every line, every signature, every timestamp, the full picture formed. My sister had been preparing to gut the building long before I ever saw the rent notice, and my grandmother had known exactly what would happen if the wrong person got too close to power. The next morning, driven by a mix of dread and resolve, I took the documents to the only lawyer my grandmother ever trusted, Daniel Price, a man with calm eyes and a reputation for quiet precision. When he read the papers, he didn't look surprised, only saddened that the moment had arrived. He explained everything with unwavering clarity. Blake Heritage LLC operated independently of any family trusts. My grandmother structured it specifically to bypass people like my parents and Whitney, and legally I held full authority over every inch of the building, meaning Whitney's rent hikes carried no legal standing. As he spoke, he opened a binder labeled with my name. A guide my grandmother had prepared outlining every step I might need to take if conflict ever escalated. The binder included timelines, contacts, financial safeguards, even handwritten notes reminding me not to let compassion turn into self-sacrifice. It was overwhelming, humbling, and terrifying, realizing she trusted me with something so enormous because she believed I would protect the people inside this building rather than profit off their vulnerability. Leaving Daniel's office, the world outside felt sharper, clearer, almost as if the city itself had shifted into focus. I wasn't powerless, not anymore. But by the end of the week, as residents moved nervously through the halls, I sensed pressure building like a storm destined to break, and it did the next morning when my sister marched into the building with 3 men in stiff suits, clipboards in hand, scanning the hall as though they were conducting an official inspection they had no right to oversee. Residents stepped out with phones recording. United after the meeting Jasmine Lee had led the night before, where she taught them their rights and the exact steps to take when confronted with intimidation. Whitney strutted ahead trying to maintain her facade of authority, but the tension in her jaw betrayed her, especially when the men hesitated under the weight of half a dozen cameras pointed at them. They checked Mrs. Alvarez's apartment first, grasping for anything to label as a violation, but found nothing. Then they moved to the Kim family's unit, where more residents stood outside in solidarity. Whitney's confidence wavered as she realized her audience wasn't intimidated, they were prepared. But she kept pushing forward, unaware that every step she took, every order she barked, every false inspection she orchestrated was being documented and time-stamped, quietly forming a case that would dismantle the illusion of power she thought she had. Meanwhile, I stood at the far end of the hallway with the binder in my hand and the legal documents tucked inside my jacket, watching her orchestrate a performance that was about to implode, because she still didn't know the truth she was walking into. The truth that the building she believed she controlled had never belonged to her, the truth that the community she tried to scatter was stronger than she imagined, and the truth that the one person she saw as weak, as manageable, as easily pushed aside, was the only person with the authority to end her entire operation with a single signature. Whitney still had no idea that every swaggering step she took down that hallway was marching her straight toward a truth she wasn't prepared for, and as I watched her bark orders at the inspectors, men who were already growing visibly uncomfortable under the pressure of being filmed by half a dozen tenants, I felt something shift inside me, not triumph, not satisfaction, but a slow-burning steadiness that felt like stepping into the role my grandmother had spent years preparing me for. Whitney stormed toward another apartment, jabbing her manicured finger at peeling paint that had been documented, scheduled for repair and fully approved. But she spun the story as if it were a health hazard, completely unaware that Mrs. Alvarez's granddaughter was holding her phone 3 inches from Whitney's face, capturing every manipulative word, and with every recorded second, Whitney's voice sharpened, cracking under the realization that she wasn't commanding the room. She was performing in a room full of witnesses who no longer feared her. When the inspectors finally huddled together whispering amongst themselves, one of them stepped aside to call someone, his eyes flicking repeatedly toward the cameras, clearly realizing this inspection wasn't legal, wasn't authorized, and wasn't something he wanted to be tied to. Whitney noticed the hesitation, her irritation swelling, and she pivoted sharply toward me, her heels clicking like gunshots down the hall as she demanded to know why I was just standing there, letting this chaos get out of hand. And there was something almost pathetic in the way she clung to her idea of authority, as if volume alone could hold together the power she never truly had. I let her speak, let her spit accusations about responsibility and family duty, and how I was embarrassing the Blake name. And in that moment, the last thread connecting us snapped because she still didn't understand that protecting people was not embarrassing. It was honoring everything our grandmother built. When she finally exhaled in a frustrated tremor, I calmly reached inside my jacket and pulled out the binder, not to wave it in her face or humiliate her, but to quietly flip to the page she never imagined existed, my grandmother's notarized transfer of ownership naming me the sole authority over the building. Whitney snatched the paper from my hand with a laugh that sounded hollow brittle, a laugh meant to dismiss, but her eyes skimmed the document, and the color drained from her face instantly. She tried to form words, tried to insist it was forged, outdated, invalid something, but the signatures were real, the seals were real, the dates aligned perfectly, and the inspectors, still holding their clipboards, leaned in just enough to read the same truth she was desperately trying to deny. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "This can't be right," because the reality was collapsing too quickly for her to stabilize, the reality that she had orchestrated a rent hike in a building she didn't own, that she had initiated an illegal inspection in a property she had zero legal authority over, that she had threatened tenants who now held hours of video evidence proving harassment, coercion, and falsified statements. The inspectors exchanged looks and quietly backed away, one of them lifting his radio to call their supervisor, muttering something about improper authorization and liability, leaving Whitney standing in the center of the hallway as if the floorboards themselves had tilted beneath her. Tenants emerged from their apartments not aggressively, not vindictively, but with a united steadiness that showed her she had never controlled them. She had only controlled their silence, and now that silence was gone. Jasmine stepped forward, her voice level as she explained tenant rights, reciting laws with precision, leaving Whitney no space to twist or manipulate the situation. My parents arrived 10 minutes later, my father's expression tight with irritation, my mother's jaw clenched, and both of them tried to sweep in as if they could rescue the situation with charm and authority, but the moment they saw the official documents in my hand, their confidence faltered. My father demanded to know how I got them, as if the answer wasn't written in my grandmother's handwriting across every page, and my mother tried to insist the transfer had been a temporary gesture, something symbolic, something not meant to be enacted, but their denial cracked around the edges the same way Whitney's had, because deep down they knew my grandmother was deliberate, meticulous, and never symbolic when it came to the people she cared about. When they realized the inspectors were watching, tenants were filming, and the building had become a stage they could no longer control, their voices softened into something almost pleading, not for the residents, but for their own reputation, their own plans, their own carefully constructed image. My father pulled me aside, lowering his voice as he spoke about family unity, financial opportunities, and how I should reconsider the long-term possibilities. But there was no warmth in his tone, no acknowledgement of the people whose lives were being shaken. He was thinking about returns, percentages, market timing, leverage, not community, not legacy, not my grandmother's intentions, and certainly not me. I told him calmly, firmly, that the rent increases were void, that the redevelopment plans were terminated, and that all harassment toward tenants would be formally documented and processed through legal channels. My mother's hand trembled as she reached for my arm, whispering that I was making a mistake, that I wasn't thinking clearly, but for the first time in years I felt more clarity than confusion, because I wasn't acting out of emotion. I was fulfilling a responsibility entrusted to me long before this conflict began. Tenants watched in stunned silence as I announced that every unlawful notice was rescinded, that maintenance schedules would return to my oversight, and that no one in the building would be displaced. And then something remarkable happened. Mrs. Alvarez stepped forward, her small, steady hands wrapping around mine with gratitude that needed no translation. The Kim family bowed their heads slightly, relief flooding their faces. Mr. Novak lifted his chin with newfound dignity. and Jasmine placed a hand on my shoulder as if to say, "You did it, you kept us safe." My parents and Whitney, however, were not relieved. They were furious, cornered, and silently calculating their next move. Whitney lunged for the documents again, muttering about lawyers, but the inspectors intercepted her, informing her that she and her contractors were required to leave immediately pending review of their unauthorized activities. The look she gave me wasn't just anger. It was betrayal, confusion, disbelief that the person she underestimated more than anyone else had become the single barrier between her ambitions and their collapse. As they exited the building, tenants gathered around me, not celebrating, not cheering, but simply standing with me in a quiet, powerful circle of solidarity, each of them understanding that something irreversible had changed. Later that night, when the hallway finally emptied and the echoes faded, I returned to my apartment and opened the last envelope from the box my grandmother had hidden, and inside was a letter addressed to me in her familiar looping script. The letter wasn't instructions or legal terms. It was love, clarity, and an explanation that she saw strength in me long before I ever recognized it in myself. She wrote that she knew the others would use the building as a ladder for their own ambitions, but she had faith that I would use it as a foundation for others, and that someday, when the time came, I would choose people over profit even if it meant standing alone. But tonight, reading her words with trembling hands, I realized I wasn't standing alone, not anymore, and maybe that was her plan all along. I folded my grandmother's letter slowly, almost afraid that if I blinked it would dissolve like smoke and take its comfort with it, and as I set it beside the box, a strange stillness settled over me, not the fragile kind that shatters with the smallest sound, but the kind that comes after a storm when the air finally remembers how to breathe. Yet even in that calm, I knew the night wasn't done with me, because people like my parents and Whitney never walked away. They regrouped, they planned, they struck when you least expected it, and the faint buzz of my phone proved that truth instantly. A flood of messages, missed calls, threats wrapped in polite phrasing, offers disguised as opportunities, and beneath it all an undercurrent of desperation, because losing power was a wound they couldn't tolerate. I let the screen dim and stepped to the window, looking out at the courtyard where tenants were still awake, talking quietly, lights glowing behind curtains, families feeling safe for the first time in months, and a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with purpose, a purpose my grandmother had protected so fiercely. But that purpose came with weight too, because I knew they wouldn't accept this loss. Not my father who built his identity on control, not my mother who curated appearances like armor, and certainly not Whitney whose pride was sharper than any blade. I could almost feel them in some boardroom or living room right now, packing, strategizing, rewriting the narrative to paint themselves as victims of betrayal rather than architects of harm, rehearsing speeches about family unity and miscommunication, preparing lawyers, gathering documents, anything to claw back the power they'd been stripped of. The thought should have scared me, but instead it grounded me, because fear no longer owned me the way it once did. I had something they didn't understand, something they couldn't purchase or manipulate, the trust of the people who lived under this roof and the legacy of the woman who had built it with her own hands. I pulled out the binder again, flipping through pages filled with maintenance logs, budgets, handwritten notes my grandmother left to herself, and I realized she hadn't just chosen me. She trained me without me even noticing, teaching me empathy through action, resilience through responsibility, and leadership through quiet consistency, and now all of that was rising inside me like a tide I couldn't stop even if I tried.